totally cool, like jam sessions and, but I'm talking about like, artists who are full-time artists, who are recording artists, making a record of new music. And sometimes they may say it's new music, but it doesn't really sound like new music because they're just taking an old song and kind of changing up the lyrics a little bit. That's not new music either. I just feel like there's a lack of, in some of these scenes here, there's too much looking back and not enough creativity. And I think that people have gotten used to it, and the audiences are accepting of it now. I mean, they didn't used to be accepting of it. It was, can you think of like back in the 90s? Were you going to see music back in the 90s?
Yes, definitely.
Can you imagine walking into a club like mid-90s to see some band you were super excited to see, like and all they did was play cover songs?
No, I would have been highly upset if I went to saw a band and they were playing nothing but cover songs after I had bought the records and had been listening to the records and was used to them playing what I wanted them to play. If they turned around and played cover songs, I'd be highly upset. But I think that the other thing that happens, and Dean, who's done some studies and helps with a hip-hop organization, everything can clarify it, is that I sometimes think that some of our other musical styles also borrow from other music, but I don't know that they do enough job. And one of the things I'll give you credit for is that you studied the past, and you studied some of these people that you alluded to earlier, whether that was Patsy Cline, whether that was Ella Fitzgerald, whether that was, you haven't mentioned her, but whether that was Billie Holiday or somebody like that. You studied them as artists, and you studied their greatness, whereas sometimes I think that some of our new musicians don't even study the artist. They just kind of like play the music. They might even, in some cases, if that's what they're about, sample the music, but I don't know that they necessarily have an understanding of what they are borrowing from. So my thing is, if you're going to borrow from it, at least have an understanding of it.
And there's so much to understand. I mean, in the phrasing, but in the songwriting, but in the history of that person, the history of that time, the history of like what was going on in music at that time. And I mean, there's so much to learn. And I think with a lot of skill, say people that build furniture. There's some people in this country who are building furniture by hand again.
Right.
But that wasn't really done for a while. Not much, because we got from where all furniture was built by skilled furniture makers to mass construction, and then IKEA. And I like IKEA once in a while too. Don't get me wrong, but like I think with even with songwriting and musicianship, I think that people aren't putting in the 10,000 hours. The 10,000 hours you have to put in to just start being good at anything. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's not like people are like, I went to the store. It's like they put together like 4 like lines that rhyme, and they're like, I'm a songwriter. Like what? Like, you got to do your work. I mean, you used to have to study with somebody. And, I mean, I know my son has put in his 10,000 already. He rehearses, like, hours and hours a day. Whatever you do as an artist, the old school way of doing it is that you immersed yourself in that, and that's all you did all the time. But I feel like people have forgotten about that because there's so many, like, cool tools you can use now, right? But it's not the same as spending the time immersing yourself in the particular artistic endeavor that you're going to be creating in. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because even musically, I wonder seriously how many people outside of music schools, because I know they still teach it in music schools, but just in general, I wonder how many people even know what the term woodshedding means, which is basically what you're alluding to. You spend hours and hours in the back of somebody's garage practicing your music and probably driving your parents and your neighbors crazy, but you would be training in that forever until you got good at it, and people definitely understood that that's what woodshedding was about. I'm thinking that if I brought that term up, to some kids, probably even some kids your own son's age, they'd probably sit there looking at me like, what's a woodshed?
Why would you go in the woodshed?
Right.
But yeah, it's everyone wants everything really fast, and we have a lot of tools. You got auto tune for vocals, and you got 9,000 pedals for guitar. But to be really good at anything, even to be really good as a parent, or to be really good as whatever you're doing in life, you have to have. It takes time to learn it. Nobody just pops out of their mother's belly and is like, ready to take on the world.
Not at all. Which brings me back to some of your early days. Because actually, I was reading this description of you that somebody gave. I'm sitting there going like, I don't know if she wants to be described that way now. But in 1998, they described you as quote unquote the flame-haired keeper of the rockabilly flame.
Well, times have changed. So it's interesting because the word rockabilly, like when you think about it now, it has a completely different meaning than it had even in the 90s. Because in the 90s, it was a very small group of people. So rockabilly basically was historically about a 3-year time period when some white people, black people were making, rock and roll back in the 40s, but they didn't. Oh, yeah. They weren't using guitar as a lead instrument. That was more, the guitar was the lead instrument more on like blues. But so when the people like at Sun Studio and some other places all over the country, these little studios, because all the bands, it was very segregated back then, but all the bands were watching each other because the players wanted to see what all the other great players were doing, and so they were all stealing from each other. Not stealing, but they were being inspired by each other, let's say. But no,
Elvis was stealing. We can be honest. Elvis was stealing.
Okay, inspired, stealing. Okay, but also the thing that they brought the lead guitar in for the first time to rock and roll, where before it was more like piano or sax was kind of the lead instrument in rock and roll. The rock and roll that white people never heard yet. And so anyway, so that time period, which was I consider like it's just barely pre-rock and roll, and we were calling it rockabilly, but it was basically just when some of the country and some people were saying hillbilly kind of bands were formulating rock and roll, and then as soon as the big label, and this was all on small labels, little local labels all over the country. And that's why it's fun to collect the records, because there's only like 20, 200 of them printed, some of them, and it's all just all over the charts. All rockabilly at that time was a big umbrella that went all the way to rhythm and blues and all the way to like country, but even I can't think of a different kind of country anyway, but then right as soon as the major labels picked it up, it was rock and roll. So you just had like a few years of this thing that they called rockabilly, and rockabilly was kind of the big bang of finally a lot of the different types of music in our country coming together, at least being presented to the full culture, and there was still a lot of problems, obviously, with things being way too separate back in 1958, clearly. But this was the first time that, to me, and maybe tell me if my perception of this is wrong, but this was the first time that it seems like black and white music came together, and I feel like it made this big bang, that just changed American music forever, Yeah,
I would definitely agree with that. That it was a major change in the way that things were reflected and the way things had happened. So I would agree that period happened. But just out of curiosity, to back up on what you just said, what is some of the rare things that you have collected? Because you said that you collected some albums. So I imagine you probably got some stuff that has amazed you that you've even been able to find it.
Yeah, like I have a couple friends that are like, the people who are the keepers of these things, and they're very hard to find. There's this dude named Hop Wilson. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, I've heard of Hop Wilson.
Oh man, so he's not really rockabilly, but he's just part of some of the things I collect. He never toured. I guess the story I've heard is he was from Houston, and he didn't like to travel, so he never really got out of Houston. And he played steel guitar, but he played steel guitar like rock and roll guitar, like an electric. It's like if you don't really listen closely, you're like, is that really a steel guitar? And he was not very well known, but one of my favorite 45s that I was trying to track down forever is one of his. It's a song called Chicken Stuff, and it's just like it's mostly instrumental, you know, and it's really kind of rocking and it's really cool. But then every once in a while it stops and it goes, Chicken Stuff. But I don't know, you know, like I have some Sun records, but I gotta have to go out and dig through my 45s to give you names. But yeah, there's just there's a lot of.
So how many records do you have? I'm thinking like this. I'm visioning like this house of yours that's got one room that's dedicated to like nothing but shelves and shelves of records. How many records have you collected?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of picky. Like, there's a lot of records. If they made a whole bunch of them, I'm like, you know, like I'm not that interested in it. So, and I don't collect. I have a lot of albums, but not just stuff that I have over the years. I don't collect albums. I collect 45s because I feel like they're historical. It's a historical. It's a piece of history that you could hold in your hand, and there's only so many of them made, and it marks a certain time period in what was going on in music at the time. I probably have a couple thousand, and I keep them in boxes sorted by however I can sort them. It's really hard to sort 45s because a lot of them, the record labels were always trying to make a hit, you know, with radio and trying to get people to buy this 45. And so one side will be, I don't know, a country something, or no, it'll be like some kind of rock and roll, and the other side will be doo-wop, you know, and you're like, which box do I put this in? But, I don't know. It's, I mean.
Is it just 45s, or do you go back as far as having a couple of 8-tracks?
I don't have 8-tracks, but I have some 78s, which is an older record, you know. And that's an interesting thing, too, that I heard, like, in the 50s. I don't know if you've heard of this, and I've read this a couple places, and I think this is true, but one of the ways that they segregated black and white music back then was the jukeboxes in the, you know, which were everywhere back then, because even like Capitol Records or the big record labels, they would have, you know, they considered it black music, and then I don't know, not black music, but the music they were making for what they considered the black community, was still made on 78s for a long time, and the radio stations that were you know, made to service the black community were still playing 78s, and all the new music that was coming out was still being played on 78s. Long after 45s, which, you know, the smaller, thinner, easier to make, was being used in the white stations and in the white jukeboxes. And that's one of the ways they kept the segregation of the music, because you couldn't go buy, you'd have to have 2 record players, you know, if you wanted to be listening to all of the music that was available. And I think it was that one guy, I can't think of his name, he might have been the one that coined the word rock and roll. There was a DJ in New York. I should know his name. But he was able to, on his radio show, put on a 78 and a 45 at the same time, so that you know, white mainstream culture could hear, you know, the new 78 music that was out that they weren't even able to play on their players.
Wow.
I just think that's really fascinating. It's just a fascinating part of. It's not a great part of it, but it's a wow. I couldn't believe that when I found that out. I'm like,